The classroom was unnaturally quiet, save for the soft tapping of pencils on paper, a sound that always seemed to echo louder in the moments before the bell rang. It was a Monday morning, and the sun had barely risen, casting weak rays through the cracked blinds. The air was stale, a blend of chalk dust and teenage sweat. Jason sat at his desk, staring blankly at the piece of paper in front of him. He had done his best, or at least he thought he had, but as the seconds ticked away, doubt crept in. At the front of the room, Mrs. Allen was sorting through a stack of graded homework assignments. She was a woman of precision, of order, and anyone who had been in her class for more than a few weeks knew that her expectations were as high as her standards. She didn't tolerate mistakes, and she certainly didn't tolerate failure. "All right," Mrs. Allen said, her voice sharp and cutting through the room like a knife. "Let's see who managed to actually do the work this time." She began reading names off the list, and one by one, students shuffled up to collect their papers. Some had smiles on their faces, others looked anxious, but everyone knew the drill. A good grade meant peace, and a bad one meant torment. The tension in the room was palpable. Jason could feel his stomach knotting. He had worked hard on the assignment, but it had felt rushed, like everything else in his life recently. Between helping his younger sister with her schoolwork and dealing with his father's unpredictable schedule, Jason had barely found time for himself. But he had to push through. He had to make sure he did well. When Mrs. Allen called his name, the room fell silent. His classmates turned to look at him, their eyes narrowing, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed judgment. Jason stood up slowly, his hands sweating. He took a deep breath and walked to the front, trying to keep his head high. Mrs. Allen handed him his paper without a word, but the look in her eyes said it all. There was disappointment there, no, more than that. There was disgust. He swallowed hard and walked back to his desk, but as he sat down, he couldn't bring himself to look at the paper. He knew what was coming. The words, the criticism. It was inevitable. He tried to focus on the next student, but his mind was racing. What if it wasn't as bad as he thought? What if he could fix it somehow? He had worked on this for hours, tweaking every sentence, checking every fact. Why couldn't she see that? Then, he heard it. "This is the worst homework I've ever seen." Mrs. Allen's voice was loud and cutting, echoing through the room, making every head snap toward her. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but somehow, Jason felt like the words were aimed directly at him. She held up his paper, the red ink bleeding through the pages, marking his failure for everyone to see. The other students, who had been whispering among themselves, went silent. A few looked at Jason with pity, but most had already begun to snicker, their eyes dancing with cruel amusement. His face burned. Mrs. Allen wasn't done. "This is laziness," she continued, her voice rising with every word. "I asked for detailed analysis, research, and clear writing. And what do I get? Half-baked nonsense." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. The words stung more than he cared to admit. He could feel his hands trembling. It wasn't just about the grade anymore. It was about the humiliation, the public shaming. And there was nothing he could do. He couldn't argue, couldn't explain. In Mrs. Allen's eyes, he was already guilty. "Jason," Mrs. Allen said, her gaze never leaving him, "this is a reflection of your work ethic. A reflection of your commitment to learning. And frankly, it's disappointing." The words were like daggers, piercing him deeper with each syllable. He wanted to shrink into the chair, to disappear into the corner of the room. But he couldn't. He had to sit there, endure it. That was his role. The silent, obedient student who took the punishment without a fight. He didn't even dare to look at the paper. He already knew what it said, corrections on every other line, comments in the margins that spoke of mediocrity, failure, and wasted potential. But the thing that struck him the hardest wasn't the comments or the grade itself, it was the judgment in her eyes. Mrs. Allen wasn't just criticizing his homework. She was questioning his character. She was implying that he wasn't good enough. That he didn't belong. And in that moment, Jason wished he could stand up, walk out of the classroom, and never look back. He wanted to tell her to stop, to let everyone know that this was a mistake. But the words never came. He was frozen in place, trapped in his own thoughts. He glanced around the room, hoping to find a sympathetic face, but instead, he saw a sea of smirks. Even his best friend, Mike, who normally had his back, seemed to be avoiding his gaze. Jason knew that in the world of high school, one misstep could define you forever. And this misstep would haunt him. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class. Mrs. Allen moved on to the next student, still muttering about homework and responsibility. But Jason couldn't move. He stayed seated, his hands gripping the edge of his desk, his mind spinning. He could hear the chatter of students. He was about to leave when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Mike standing there, his face unreadable. "Hey, man, you okay?" Mike asked quietly. Jason forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine." Mike didn't seem convinced, but he nodded and walked out, leaving Jason alone with his thoughts. Jason stared at the empty classroom, the walls closing in around him. His mind raced. What now? He could feel the tension building. Something inside him was shifting, a feeling he couldn't quite place. His thoughts returned to his father. His father, the man whose name commanded respect, whose mere presence could silence anyone. What would his father think of all this? What if Jason told Mrs. Allen who his father really was? What if he revealed the truth about his family, the legacy that loomed over him like a shadow? But no. He couldn't. Not yet. Not here. He left the classroom, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallways. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. This moment, this small, seemingly insignificant event, was just the beginning of something much bigger. He didn't know what was coming next. But he felt it. Deep down, he felt it. And Jason knew that the next time someone made fun of him, the next time someone insulted him, things would be different. He wouldn't just sit there, taking it. No, this time, he would do something. He didn't know what that something was yet, but he would find it. The game had changed. Part 2, A Chain of Consequences. The next day was Monday, but it felt nothing like a new beginning. It was as though the events of Friday afternoon, the humiliation in front of his classmates, had left an indelible mark on Jason. The world felt different now. The walls of his high school seemed to close in tighter, the air heavier. He couldn't escape the sinking feeling that something was shifting, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. All he knew was that things were about to change, and he was caught in the middle. As he sat at his desk that morning, the usual noise of students chatting, laughing, and gossiping seemed muffled. Jason stared at his notebook, his mind drifting back to the moment in Mrs. Allen's class when she had publicly torn apart his homework. He hadn't been able to shake her words from his mind, each one replaying in his head like a cruel song on loop. "You didn't even try," she had said, her voice a sharp crack against his chest. He hadn't understood how it had all gone so wrong. He had worked so hard on that paper, but no matter how much effort he put in, it seemed like he couldn't escape the feeling of failure. But something had changed in him after that. He didn't feel just angry anymore. He didn't feel like a victim. A deep, almost primal urge had awakened inside of him. He was done being underestimated, done hiding in the shadows. He didn't know how or why, but he felt that the truth about him, his family, and what lay beneath the surface, was about to come to light. The bell rang, snapping Jason out of his thoughts. Mrs. Allen's voice filled the room, harsh and commanding as usual. "Everyone, take out your notes for today's lesson," she said, her eyes scanning the room. But Jason couldn't focus on what she was saying. His mind was elsewhere, on the power he could wield, the legacy he carried, and the mystery of how it all fit into his life. As Mrs. Allen began her lecture, Jason's eyes wandered to the clock on the wall. Time seemed to crawl by, and the weight of his thoughts only seemed to grow heavier. He felt like he was trapped in a cage of his own making, but he wasn't sure how to escape. It wasn't until lunchtime that the first crack in his resolve appeared. Jason was sitting at his usual spot in the cafeteria, pushing his food around on his tray, barely tasting it. His friend Mike sat across from him, his eyes darting nervously between Jason and the others in the room. Jason noticed the way Mike kept glancing toward the table where the popular crowd sat, the jocks, the cheerleaders, the ones who always seemed to have everything figured out. They were all laughing, carefree, their lives seemingly perfect. But then, Jason's gaze locked on one face in the crowd, the one person who had made his life unbearable in the last few days, Sarah. Sarah Johnson. The girl who had once been his closest friend, but now seemed to take every opportunity to make him feel small. She was sitting with a group of girls, laughing, glancing over at him every now and then with that smirk on her face. It had all started years ago when Jason had first moved to town. Sarah had been his best friend, someone he could trust. They would share everything, their dreams, their fears, their secrets. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Jason's father, a powerful man with connections that extended beyond their small town, had started to get involved in local politics, and Sarah had begun to pull away. Slowly, but surely, she had started to distance herself from him. The insults, the whispers behind his back, the condescending glances, he'd seen them all. But this was different. She was now actively trying to embarrass him in front of everyone. And the worst part? Jason wasn't sure if it was because of his father's reputation or something deeper, something that had nothing to do with him at all. Jason's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the edge of his tray. He had always tried to stay out of the drama, to keep his head down and focus on his work. But the constant attacks, both subtle and direct, were starting to wear him down. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. "Jason," Mike said quietly, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Are you okay, man? You've been kind of off lately." Jason looked up at Mike, his friend's worried expression pulling at his chest. Mike had been with him through everything, through thick and thin. But lately, Jason had felt like he was slipping away from everyone, like he was becoming someone he didn't recognize. "Yeah, I'm fine," Jason replied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." Mike didn't buy it, but he didn't press. Instead, he nodded and turned his attention back to his sandwich, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that his friend knew more than he was letting on. As the lunch period wore on, Jason couldn't help but feel the weight of the conversation from earlier. The humiliation in front of the class. The way everyone seemed to have turned their back on him. It was clear now, he was on his own. But he wasn't helpless. He wasn't just going to let this slide. No, this was the beginning of something bigger, something he wasn't ready to fully understand yet. But he knew one thing: he wasn't going to stay silent any longer. After school, Jason walked slowly toward his locker, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He could feel the eyes of his classmates on him as he passed, but he kept his head down, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing his discomfort. His locker creaked as he opened it, the noise sharp in the silence. Jason shoved his books inside, his mind racing. He was no longer the quiet, invisible kid. He wasn't just going to fade into the background. Something inside him had shifted, and he needed to do something about it. As he slammed the locker shut, a voice called out from behind him. "Jason, wait up." He turned to see Mike jogging toward him, his face serious. "Hey, what's up?" Jason asked, trying to sound casual, though his heart was racing. Mike hesitated for a moment before speaking. Look, I don't know if this is the right time, but I think you need to hear something. Jason raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. What are you talking about? Mike glanced around nervously, as if making sure no one else was listening. It's about your dad. There's been some talk, some rumors. Jason's stomach sank. His father's name had always been a subject of whispers in the town, but he hadn't thought it was this bad. What had Mike heard? Rumors? Jason asked, his voice tight. What kind of rumors? Mike lowered his voice even further. Look, I don't know if it's true, but some people are saying that your dad's involved in something big. Like, really big. Like, criminal big. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He tried to laugh it off, but the weight of Mike's words settled over him like a heavy cloak. His father, a criminal? That couldn't be possible. But then again, there were always whispers, always speculation about the power his father wielded in the shadows. Mike, that's crazy, Jason said, forcing the words out even as a chill ran down his spine. My dad isn't involved in anything like that. Mike looked at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know, man. But the rumors, they're out there. And people are starting to talk. Jason didn't respond. He didn't know what to think. His father had always kept his personal life separate from Jason's, but now, in the wake of the humiliation at school, Jason couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story. Was his father hiding something? Was that why Jason had been getting the cold shoulder? Because of who his father was? For the first time in a long while, Jason felt a sense of fear creeping in, not just for himself, but for his family. He didn't know what to believe anymore. The weekend passed in a blur for Jason. His mind was consumed with the unsettling conversation he'd had with Mike, but there was little time to dwell on it. Life had a way of moving forward, even when you weren't ready. And Jason wasn't ready, not for the truth, not for what he was about to discover. Monday morning arrived far too soon, and as Jason walked into school, the usual sense of dread settled over him. The halls were buzzing with energy, the students talking in their usual cliques, but Jason felt as if he were walking through a fog. Everything seemed distant, muffled, like he was outside looking in. He tried to push the thoughts of his father's rumored involvement in something dark out of his mind, but it was impossible. The rumors were too persistent, the whispers too loud. Mike's words echoed in his mind like a broken record. Your dad's involved in something big. Like, really big. Like, criminal big. The thought was ludicrous. His father, criminal? It didn't make sense. His father had always been the man of integrity, the one who had worked hard to build his reputation. Jason had never seen anything in his life to suggest otherwise. But the rumors were like a crack in the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't being told. Something important. And the more he thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. The truth was out there, and Jason was determined to uncover it. As he walked to his first class, he spotted Sarah again. This time, she wasn't just sitting with her usual group of friends. She was standing by the lockers, laughing with some of the most popular guys in school, guys who had always seemed untouchable. Jason felt a jolt of frustration as he watched her, the same frustration that had been building inside of him for weeks. She had once been his closest friend, and now it felt like she was part of a world that was deliberately shutting him out. He was about to look away when Sarah turned and caught his eye. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and something passed between them, a flicker of recognition, but also a wall. She quickly turned away, but not before Jason saw the look in her eyes. It was a look of superiority, of knowing something he didn't. Jason clenched his fists. He had to get to the bottom of this. He couldn't let her, or anyone, control the narrative. He wasn't some lost boy to be discarded and laughed at. He had a right to know the truth about his family, about who he really was. His thoughts were interrupted when the bell rang, signaling the start of his first class. Mrs. Allen was already at the front of the room, scanning the students with her usual stern expression. Jason could feel her eyes on him as he took his seat, but he didn't meet her gaze. He wasn't in the mood for her usual lecture, not today. He was preoccupied with the questions swirling in his mind. The class passed in a blur. Jason tried to focus on the lesson, but it was impossible. Every time he looked up, he saw Sarah's face, and the memory of her smug expression lingered in his mind. He could feel the weight of her judgment, her silence, and it made him feel smaller than he ever had before. When the bell rang again, Jason gathered his things and rushed out of the classroom. He needed to talk to someone, but not just anyone. He needed to talk to someone who knew the truth. Someone who could tell him what was really going on. The school day seemed endless. Jason could barely pay attention in his next classes, and he found himself tapping his foot nervously under his desk, waiting for the bell to signal the end of the day. But he couldn't wait. Not anymore. After school, he walked to his locker and then to the parking lot, his mind racing. He had made a decision. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them sitting idly by. He had to talk to his father. Jason had never been one to confront his father about anything, let alone about rumors that cast shadows over their family. But something had changed. Something inside him had snapped. The idea of continuing to live under this cloud of uncertainty, of letting the rumors dictate his life, was no longer an option. Jason's father was an enigma, a man of mystery and power, someone who had always been there for him in his own way, but never with full transparency. He didn't share much about his work, his connections, or his personal life. Jason had learned to accept that. But now, with the weight of the rumors pressing on him, he could no longer remain in the dark. He took a deep breath and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He hesitated for a moment before dialing his father's number. The phone rang twice before his father's deep voice answered, the same voice that had always carried a sense of authority and calm. "Jason," his father said, a hint of surprise in his tone. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" Jason swallowed hard. His father always seemed to know when something was wrong. It was as if he could sense the trouble in the air, even from a distance. But this time, Jason couldn't hide it. "I need to talk to you," Jason said, his voice shaky. About something I heard. Something people are saying." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jason could practically hear his father's mind working, the gears turning as he processed the words. "What did you hear?" his father asked, his tone cautious, but not entirely surprised. Jason felt his stomach drop. This was it, the moment where everything changed. The moment he either got the answers he had been seeking, or he remained in the dark, trapped by the mystery of his own family. "They're saying," Jason faltered, unsure of how to phrase it. "They're saying you're involved in something. Something bad. Something criminal." There was another long silence. Jason held his breath, waiting for his father's response. When it came, it was cold and firm. "Who's saying that?" his father asked. Jason felt the weight of his father's question press down on him. He didn't want to name names, not yet. He wasn't sure how much he could trust. But he had to say something. It's Mike. And other people. They're talking about you. About what you do. And it's not good." His father's voice softened, but there was an edge to it now. "Jason, you know how people talk. You know how rumors spread, how easily they can be twisted into something they're not." "I know, but," Jason hesitated. "Why won't you tell me what's really going on? I've heard things. I need to know what's true." Jason's father sighed deeply. "You don't understand, Jason. Not yet. I've kept things from you to protect you. You don't need to be involved in the world I'm in. It's not a world for a kid your age. And the rumors you're hearing, they're just that. Rumors. Jason's mind raced. There it was. His father had confirmed it. There was something going on, something bigger than he could comprehend. But the question was, how much of it was true? I need to know, Dad. I need the truth. I can't live with this uncertainty anymore, Jason pleaded. His voice was raw now, the frustration he had been holding back for so long spilling out. I'll explain everything soon, his father said, his voice more urgent now. But not today. Not yet. Just trust me. Jason didn't know what to think anymore. His father was offering him crumbs of information, but not enough to satisfy the hunger for answers that gnawed at him. He didn't feel reassured. He felt more lost than ever. Why can't you tell me now? Jason asked, his voice rising. Why keep me in the dark? You're not ready, his father said simply. You need to focus on your studies, your life. This isn't something you can understand just yet. Jason's grip on the phone tightened. I'm not a child anymore. His father was quiet for a moment before speaking again. I know. But there are things you don't need to know. Things I'm trying to protect you from. Jason was silent, his mind spinning. He didn't know what to believe anymore. The man he had trusted his whole life, the man who had always seemed like an unshakable pillar of strength, was now shrouded in mystery. And Jason didn't know how much longer he could keep pretending everything was fine. Finally, his father spoke again, his voice firm. Jason, I will tell you everything in time. But right now, you need to trust me. And you need to be patient. Jason swallowed the lump in his throat. He didn't want to wait. He didn't want to trust his father's vague reassurances. But what choice did he have? Okay, Jason said quietly. I'll wait. The call ended, and Jason stood there, staring at the phone in his hand. He didn't know what to think, but he knew one thing for certain, things were changing, and there was no turning back. The days after his conversation with his father felt like a blur. Jason walked through the motions of his life, going to school, sitting through classes, and meeting his friends, but everything felt muted. There was a heavy silence surrounding him, one that weighed on his chest, pressing down with every breath he took. The world around him seemed to spin without him, a life he no longer felt a part of. Each time he passed by his father's study, each time his father wasn't home, a new sense of unease would creep up on him. What was the truth? What was it that his father had been keeping from him? The worst part? Jason didn't know how much longer he could stand the silence. It wasn't just his father's cryptic words hanging over him. The school environment had become unbearable, and every day felt like a battle. Sarah's presence was suffocating, her sharp eyes never left him, her taunts growing bolder, more subtle. The other kids, her followers, joined in too, offering looks of pity or sneers of superiority when they thought he wasn't watching, but it was Sarah who really cut deep. They used to be best friends, inseparable, sharing secrets, laughter, and moments of comfort. Now, she was nothing more than a reminder of everything he couldn't change, the betrayal, the alienation, the whispered judgments that followed him everywhere. And yet, he had to confront her, eventually. He couldn't keep running. Jason's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of the school bell ringing, signaling the start of his afternoon classes. He slowly stood up, gathering his things and heading toward the door, but his mind was elsewhere, on the growing mystery surrounding his family, and more specifically, his father. As Jason walked into his last class of the day, a shiver ran through him. The class felt colder than usual. The students were all gathered in their usual seats, but there was a heaviness in the air, something unspoken. Jason could sense that something had shifted, but he couldn't quite place it. He tried to shake off the feeling as he sat down at his desk, but it lingered, like an ominous cloud hanging overhead. Mrs. Allen entered the room, her expression as stern as ever, but there was something different about her today. She seemed distracted. There was a slight tremor in her hands as she began writing on the board. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something. That she had been watching him too closely. "Today, we're going to discuss some new material," Mrs. Allen said, her voice tight, as though she was struggling to keep her usual control. "But first, I need to address something from last week." Jason's stomach twisted into knots. He knew exactly where this was going. Mrs. Allen wasn't one to forget his paper, the one she had insulted in front of the whole class, the one that had ignited everything. It had been a moment of cruelty, of judgment, and Jason was still reeling from it. "I'm aware that there were some strong reactions to the homework last week," she continued, glancing at Jason with a strange look in her eyes. "And I want to make it clear that I do not tolerate excuses in this class. We all have our challenges, but we cannot allow them to stand in the way of doing our best work." Jason felt his blood run cold. She was talking directly to him now, her words cutting through him like ice. She wasn't even acknowledging the context, the fact that he had worked tirelessly on that assignment, the fact that he had done everything he could and still failed in her eyes. But here she was, standing at the front of the room, as if she were the embodiment of righteousness, casting judgment without even knowing the full story. He felt the eyes of his classmates on him. Some were sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few of them, like Sarah, looked at him with cold amusement. The taunting glint in Sarah's eyes was unmistakable. It felt like she was enjoying this, enjoying his pain, his humiliation. Jason clenched his fists under the desk. He was done. He couldn't take this any longer. But he also knew he wasn't in a position to lash out, not yet. He needed to be smart about this. Mrs. Allen moved on with the lesson, but Jason's mind was a whirlwind. His focus had shattered, and all he could think about was the quiet storm brewing inside of him. The more he thought about his father's cryptic warning, the more he began to question his own role in this twisted narrative. Was he being manipulated? Was there something his father had been shielding him from? Or was he simply a pawn in a much larger game? Jason's thoughts swirled in circles as the class continued. The lesson on history seemed irrelevant to him now. Every piece of information felt like a distant echo. His mind drifted to the conversation he'd had with his father. He needed more than reassurances. He needed answers. The silence had gone on long enough. As soon as the bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Jason grabbed his bag and rushed out of the classroom. He needed to talk to his father again. He couldn't wait any longer. His frustration was too great, his sense of helplessness too overwhelming. But as Jason rounded the corner near the school exit, he froze. There, standing by the doors of the school, was Sarah. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. Jason didn't want to confront her. He didn't want to face her after everything that had happened, after the cruel words and cold looks. But there was something about her presence now that stopped him in his tracks. "Jason," Sarah said, her voice soft but sharp. "We need to talk." Jason didn't respond at first. He wasn't sure if he could even trust her anymore. What did she want from him? "You've been avoiding me," Sarah continued, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to him. "And I think I deserve an explanation." Jason stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. His heart was pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, to push her away, but something held him back. "You deserve an explanation?" he asked, his voice laced with bitterness. "After everything? After how you've treated me, you think you deserve an explanation?" Sarah flinched at his words, but she quickly regained her composure. "Jason, I know you're angry. I know things have been weird between us. But there's more going on here than you realize." Jason blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Your father, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. There's a lot more to him than you think. People are talking about him, about what he's involved in. And you're not hearing the full story. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He took a step back. What are you saying? You're just trying to mess with me, Sarah. I don't have time for your games. I'm not messing with you, Jason, Sarah said urgently. I know things about your father, about the people he's connected to. It's not what you think. It's not as simple as you've been led to believe. Jason's head was spinning. What was she saying? Why was she telling him this now? And what could she possibly know about his father's connections? You need to listen to me, Sarah continued, her tone more serious now. There are things happening behind the scenes, and you need to be prepared for what's coming. You think you know your dad, but you don't. He's been hiding things from you, and I think you're starting to figure that out. Jason's breath caught in his throat. How do you know all this? I know people, Sarah replied, her voice lower now, almost as if she were afraid of being overheard. And I've seen things. Heard things. I know what your dad is involved in, Jason. It's bigger than you think. Jason's mind raced, his thoughts chaotic. This was the moment where everything could change. Could he trust Sarah? Could he trust anyone? She was the last person he ever thought he'd turn to for answers, yet here she was, giving him a glimpse into a side of his father's life that he hadn't even known existed. Why are you telling me this? Jason asked, his voice trembling slightly. Sarah's expression softened for a moment, and Jason saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. Because I don't want you to be caught off guard, she said. I don't want you to wake up one day and realize that you've been living a lie your whole life. Jason stared at her for a long time, uncertainty clouding his thoughts. Could he trust her? Was this the truth? Or was she just trying to manipulate him further? But one thing was clear, he couldn't ignore what she was saying. Not anymore. I don't know what to believe, Jason whispered. But I need to know more. You will, Sarah said softly. Sooner than you think. Jason didn't sleep much that night. The conversation with Sarah had left his mind in a storm of confusion. What did she know? How much of it was true? And why was she offering him these cryptic warnings? It all felt like a puzzle, with pieces that didn't fit together. His father was a man of secrets, and now Sarah, of all people, was suggesting that there was even more to uncover. Jason couldn't let it go. Every time he closed his eyes, the fragments of their conversation replayed in his head. He had to get answers, real answers. He couldn't live in this fog anymore, not with everything at stake. His entire world had been upended, and the more he dug, the deeper the hole seemed to get. The next day at school was no better. The whispers continued, only this time they weren't just about his homework or the things he had done wrong. Now, people were talking about his father. The rumors were everywhere. Jason could hear them in the hallways, in the cafeteria, behind closed doors. The whispers were unmistakable. His father wasn't just a successful businessman, no, according to some, he was part of something much darker. Jason could feel the heat of their gazes, the weight of their judgment, pressing on him from every direction. His classmates didn't know the whole story, didn't know the full truth about his father, but they didn't need to. The seeds of doubt had already been planted, and now, they were growing into something that couldn't be ignored. The day dragged on, and Jason found himself in a state of constant unrest. His mind raced from one thought to the next, and he couldn't focus on anything. Every class felt like a blur, the lessons mere background noise to the storm brewing inside of him. But he couldn't escape it. No matter where he went, the mystery of his father loomed over him, an insurmountable wall that he had to scale if he was ever going to find peace. When the bell rang to signal the end of the school day, Jason was already halfway to the door. He didn't want to deal with the looks, the whispers. He just wanted to go home. He wanted to confront his father. He had no more patience left for waiting. But as he walked out into the parking lot, his phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. "Meet me behind the gym. I need to tell you something important. It's about your dad." Jason's heart skipped a beat. His fingers hovered over the screen as he debated whether to go. Was this a trap? Was she playing him, leading him deeper into something he wasn't prepared for? But he couldn't resist. Not after everything. He had to know. Within minutes, Jason was walking toward the back of the gym, the air heavy with tension. The space behind the gym was shadowed, away from the prying eyes of the school. It was quiet here, too quiet. The world felt like it had shrunk, leaving him with only the feeling of his own heartbeat pounding in his chest. And then he saw her. Sarah was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, her face serious in a way Jason had never seen before. She wasn't the girl who had taunted him, nor was she the person who had once been his best friend. This was someone else entirely, someone who had seen things Jason couldn't yet comprehend. "Jason," Sarah said, her voice low. "I told you to meet me here because I need to warn you. There's more to your father's involvement than you realize. He's not who you think he is. He's not just a businessman." Jason stood frozen for a moment, his heart racing in his chest. "What are you talking about? I thought we already covered this. What do you know?" Sarah's eyes flickered nervously, and she stepped closer. "You don't understand the danger you're in. There are people watching you. People watching him. And I'm not talking about regular people. I'm talking about people who have power. Who do things most people can't even imagine." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying? What kind of people?" "The kind of people who don't play by the rules. The kind who control everything from the shadows." "And your father?" "He's mixed up in all of it," Sarah whispered, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "He's in deep, Jason. He's been protecting you, but you have no idea the lengths he's gone to, the things he's done to keep you safe." Jason shook his head, disbelief flooding his senses. "No. This doesn't make sense. My dad's not involved in anything like that. He's just a businessman?" "No, Jason. He's not. And you need to stop fooling yourself. He's involved in something dangerous. And it's only a matter of time before it catches up with you. With both of you." Jason took a step back, his stomach twisting. "So what? You want me to just walk away from my father? To just let him go and pretend everything's fine?" Sarah's face softened for a moment. "I don't want you to do anything, Jason. I'm just trying to warn you. There are things happening that you can't see. And once they come for you, there won't be any turning back." Jason felt his pulse quicken. His mind was a blur of confusion, of fear, of everything he had believed to be true suddenly crashing down around him. He wanted to trust his father. He wanted to believe that everything Sarah was saying was just a lie, that she was trying to manipulate him. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was telling the truth. The air between them felt thick with the weight of the secrets that had been shared, the ones that Jason wasn't ready to face. But there was no escaping it now. "Do you want to know the truth?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you want to know what your father has been hiding? Because once you start looking, there's no going back." Jason didn't answer immediately. He didn't know what he wanted. Part of him wanted to walk away, to escape this nightmare before it consumed him. But another part, one he couldn't deny, needed to know the truth. He had to understand what was really happening. He nodded slowly, his voice quiet but firm. "Tell me." Sarah's eyes searched his face, as if weighing whether or not to continue. Finally, she exhaled, as if making a decision. "Your father's not just involved in business deals. He's mixed up in something much darker. I don't know all the details, but I know enough to tell you this: he's been working with people who do things for profit. They hurt people. They make people disappear. They've been doing it for years, and your dad's hands aren't clean." Jason recoiled at her words. His father, the man he had looked up to, the man who had raised him, was involved in something criminal? It felt like a betrayal, something so huge that Jason didn't know if he could recover from it. "You're lying," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. "This isn't possible." "I wish I was," Sarah said, her voice tight. "But it's the truth. And you need to be ready for it." The world felt like it was shifting beneath his feet, and Jason struggled to keep his balance. He had to get away from Sarah. He couldn't hear anymore, not right now. It was too much. "I need to go," he said, his voice strained, and he turned to walk away. "Jason!" Sarah called after him, her voice desperate. "Don't ignore this. Don't walk away from it. It's not going to end well if you do." But Jason didn't stop. His mind was spinning. The weight of her words was suffocating, and he couldn't breathe. He needed to be alone, to process everything she had just said, even though part of him didn't want to believe it. But deep down, Jason knew something. He knew he couldn't ignore the truth forever. As he walked out of the school and toward his car, the world seemed to close in on him. The air felt thick, the sky above darkening in a way that matched the turmoil in his chest. He didn't know what to do with this new reality. But one thing was certain: he was no longer living in the world he once knew. And the truth was coming for him, whether he was ready for it or not. Jason couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's words. They lingered like a shadow over him, haunting him every second of every day. He didn't know what was worse: the fact that she had told him these things, or the unsettling sense that she might be telling the truth. His father, the man he had always admired, the man he had trusted above all others, was involved in something dark and dangerous. Something that, if anyone found out, would change everything. The days following their conversation felt like they were dragging on forever. Jason barely slept, his mind a constant whirlwind of thoughts, doubts, and questions. His relationship with his father, once so solid, now felt fragile, like it was built on lies. Jason had never seen any signs of corruption in his father's behavior, no dark side, no signs of anything unusual. But Sarah's warning had planted a seed, and now Jason couldn't unsee what he had learned. At school, everything felt different. The rumors about his father had grown stronger, and though Jason tried to avoid the whispers, they were impossible to ignore. His classmates had begun to look at him differently, as though they knew something he didn't. Some of them even seemed to pity him, as if they knew something about his father's past that he was too blind to see. Jason had always been an outsider, but now, it felt as though he was a stranger to everyone, including himself. His whole identity was being torn apart by the very people he had always trusted. The one person who remained silent about everything was his father. Jason's conversations with him had become stilted, awkward. It wasn't that his father was cold, but there was something off, something that Jason couldn't quite put his finger on. Maybe his dad had sensed the change in him, the way he looked at him with suspicion, the way Jason had started pulling away. Or maybe, just maybe, his father knew that the time for secrets was over. Jason had decided, after much internal struggle, that he couldn't let this go. He couldn't keep living in fear of what might happen if he kept digging. The truth, no matter how painful, was something he had to face. And if it meant confronting his father, if it meant risking everything, then so be it. That evening, after dinner, when his father was sitting in his favorite armchair, the one by the fireplace, Jason knew it was time. He had to ask. He had to know what his father was hiding. No more pretending, no more avoiding the truth. "Dad," Jason began, his voice shaky, but determined. "There's something I need to know." His father looked up from his book, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "What's on your mind, son?" Jason swallowed hard. The words stuck in his throat, but he forced them out. "I know you're hiding something. Something about your past. About what you've done." His father's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you talking about, Jason?" "Don't lie to me," Jason insisted, his voice rising now, a mix of frustration and fear. "I know about the people you're connected to. I know about the deals you've made, the things you've done. I know everything." There was a long pause. His father's expression was unreadable. Then, finally, he set the book aside and leaned forward, his gaze fixed firmly on Jason. "You're wrong," he said quietly, the words heavy with something Jason couldn't quite place. "You don't know anything. Then why didn't you tell me? Why haven't you said anything?" Jason's voice cracked, the floodgates of his emotions bursting open. "Why have you kept all of this from me? I'm your son. I deserve to know the truth." Jason's father stood up slowly, walking toward the window. He stood there for a long time, his back to Jason, staring out into the night. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost sad. "Sometimes the truth is more dangerous than the lie," he said quietly. "There are things in this world you can't unlearn. Things that, once you know them, will change everything." Jason took a step closer, his heart racing. "I can handle it. I need to know, Dad." His father turned to face him then, his eyes filled with something Jason couldn't name. "You think you're ready to hear the truth? You think you're strong enough to handle what I've done, what I've been a part of?" Jason didn't hesitate. "Yes. I have to know." His father's expression softened, a hint of regret passing over his face. "I never wanted you to get involved in any of this. I've always tried to protect you, to keep you away from it. But the truth is," he paused, collecting his thoughts. "The truth is that I'm not just a businessman. I'm involved in things that, if the wrong people found out, could destroy us both." Jason's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" His father took a deep breath, the weight of the secret settling heavily on him. "I've made deals with people who don't play by the rules. Powerful people. People who can make things disappear. And I've done things for them, things I regret, but things I had no choice in. They've held something over my head for years, and I've done whatever it takes to keep you safe from it." Jason felt as though the ground was slipping from beneath his feet. "What kind of things? What have you done, Dad?" His father's face hardened. "I can't tell you everything. But I can tell you this, I've kept you safe from the worst of it. You don't know the half of what I've had to sacrifice to keep our family out of it." Jason was reeling. He couldn't process it all. His father, the man who had always been his hero, the man he had looked up to, had been involved in illegal activities, dark, dangerous dealings with people who didn't care about right or wrong. "I've been trying to protect you, Jason," his father said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I've also kept you in the dark. And that's not fair to you. You deserve to know what's going on, even if it means putting your life in danger." Jason stood there, struggling to grasp the full weight of his father's words. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. He wanted to be angry, to scream, but instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, of betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His father looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping. "I couldn't. I thought I could protect you from it, but I see now that I've failed you. And I'm sorry." Jason took a step back, his thoughts swirling in confusion. The man he had thought he knew, the man he had trusted above all others, was a part of something dark and dangerous. His father wasn't just a man, he was a man who had been carrying a burden for years, a burden that Jason had never known existed. And now, Jason had a choice to make. He could walk away from this, pretend it didn't matter, live in ignorance. Or he could choose to dig deeper, to uncover the full extent of his father's secrets. The question was he ready for what he would find? Jason sat in silence, the words his father had spoken reverberating in his mind. He had spent his entire life idolizing the man, and now, in one conversation, that image was shattered. His father wasn't just the man who had raised him with care and love. No, he was someone far more complicated, someone involved in things Jason could never have imagined. The weight of this new knowledge settled heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time in his life, Jason questioned everything he thought he knew about the world. His father's words echoed in his head, "I've done things, dark things, to protect you." Protect him. The irony stung. If anything, it felt like his father's attempts at protection had led Jason straight into the heart of a nightmare. Everything he thought was secure, everything he thought was right, was now in question. Jason didn't know what to think. The revelation that his father had been involved in shady, dangerous dealings was one thing, but the fact that he had kept it hidden for so long was another. And now that Jason knew, could he really walk away? Could he turn a blind eye to the truth, go on living a normal life, pretending none of this had happened? As Jason sat on his bed later that night, his thoughts became a jumbled mess. There were too many questions, too many unknowns. His father's confession had opened a door that could never be closed, and now Jason had no choice but to walk through it, no matter how dark it might be. The hours stretched on, and sleep refused to come. His mind buzzed with the implications of everything he had learned. He had to know more. He had to understand the full scope of what his father had been involved in, what he had been involved in. But where could he even begin? The answers weren't going to come easily, but Jason had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to sit in the dark any longer. The next morning, Jason's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Sarah again. "Meet me at the park. I know where your father's hiding something. If you really want to understand, you need to come now." His heart raced as he read the message. There was no time to waste. If Sarah knew more, if she had the answers he was desperately searching for, he couldn't afford to ignore her. Jason grabbed his jacket and left the house quickly, the cold air biting at his skin as he made his way to the park. His mind was still spinning from the conversation with his father, and now this new message only deepened the mystery. What did Sarah know? What could she possibly tell him that would make sense of all this chaos? When he arrived at the park, Sarah was already waiting by the bench near the old oak tree, looking around nervously, as if she feared someone might be watching. As soon as she saw him, she motioned for him to come over. "Jason, you need to listen to me. I've found something. Something that could explain everything. But you have to promise me you'll be careful." Her voice was low, urgent. Jason didn't hesitate. "What did you find? What's going on?" Sarah glanced over her shoulder before speaking again. "I've been doing some digging. I didn't believe it at first, but now I do. Your father's not just hiding things from you, he's hiding things from everyone. There are people who want to find him. They're after him." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "Who? Why?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't know all the details, but they're dangerous people. They're connected to everything your father's been involved in. And they won't stop until they find him. But the worst part?" She paused, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father's been lying to you. He's not just protecting you from them. He's been using you as a pawn in something bigger than either of you realize." Jason recoiled at her words. "What are you talking about? I'm not some pawn." "Not yet, but you will be," she said quickly, her tone urgent. "Jason, you've been dragged into this whether you know it or not. Your father made sure you were kept out of it for as long as possible, but now that you know the truth, now that you've started digging, you're a target. You need to understand something. They've been watching you. Jason took a step back, trying to process what she was saying. You're telling me that people are watching me? Because of what my father's done? Sarah nodded gravely. Yes. Your father's actions have consequences, and those consequences are coming for you. You can't escape it. But there's something even worse going on, something I didn't realize until now. Jason's stomach churned. What? What is it? The reason your father's been keeping all these secrets, the reason he's been so desperate to protect you, is because you're connected to all of this. You're a part of it, whether you like it or not. And if you don't act fast, if you don't figure out exactly what's going on, you might not make it out of this alive. Jason felt the ground beneath him shift. What are you talking about? I don't understand. How am I connected to any of this? Sarah's eyes darted around nervously. I don't have all the answers, Jason, but I think your father made a mistake. He's been hiding the truth about you, the truth about who you really are. You've asked for the truth, his father began, his voice low. And I'll give it to you. But you need to understand something first. Once you know, there's no going back. I've tried to protect you from all of this, from the danger that's been following me, following us. But the truth always has a way of coming to light. Jason swallowed hard, his throat dry. I'm ready, Dad. I need to know. His father nodded slowly, and for the first time, Jason saw a crack in the armor his father had built around himself. All right. I'll start from the beginning. It was a story Jason had never expected to hear. His father's voice was heavy with guilt and regret as he spoke, each word carrying the weight of years of deception. Jason listened in stunned silence, his world crumbling around him as the truth was revealed. Your mother and I, we were young when we met. Too young to know what we were getting ourselves into. I was working in a small business, trying to make a name for myself. But that business, that small, innocent-looking company, was a front for something much larger. I didn't know it at first, Jason. I thought it was just a way to get ahead, to make a life for us. But the deeper I got, the more I realized I was in over my head. And by the time I understood what I had become a part of, it was too late. Jason sat frozen, the words sinking in like cold steel. He could feel the walls of the house closing in around him. This was more than just a mistake. This was a lifetime of choices made in the shadows, a lifetime of secrets too dangerous to be shared. You were just a baby when I made the deal, his father continued, his voice thick with emotion. I never wanted this for you. I never wanted you to be involved in any of this. But you are, Jason. You always have been. The business I joined wasn't just about money, it was about power. It was about control. And it led me into dangerous territory. The people I worked for, the people who funded everything, were ruthless. They don't care about right or wrong. They only care about getting what they want. Jason could hardly breathe. His father had been a part of something criminal, something that threatened not only their lives but the lives of everyone around them. He had always trusted his father. And now that trust felt like it had been betrayed on every level. What do you mean, I've always been a part of it? Jason's voice trembled with confusion and fear. What are you talking about, Dad? I've never been involved in anything like that. His father looked at him with a mixture of sadness and guilt. Jason, I didn't want you to know. But it's the truth. You've always been a target. You were born into this, whether you liked it or not. Your mother and I tried to keep you away from it. We kept you out of the family business, tried to give you a normal life. But that's not how the world works. You were always going to be caught up in this eventually. Jason felt as though the floor was falling away beneath him. The truth was more than he could handle, more than he could comprehend. His father's words were like a storm, and Jason was standing in the middle of it, helpless to stop it. "But why didn't you tell me, Dad?" Jason's voice cracked with emotion. "Why keep this from me? Why protect me from it if I was already part of it?" His father took a deep breath, his face filled with pain. "Because I thought I could protect you from the worst of it. I thought if I kept you in the dark, if I shielded you from the truth, you could have a normal life. But I was wrong. The truth always finds its way out." Jason was on the verge of tears, the weight of everything crashing down on him. "What do you mean the worst of it? What have you done? What am I supposed to do now?" His father leaned forward, his face hardening with resolve. "You have to make a choice, Jason. You have to decide what kind of man you want to be. Do you want to run away from all of this? Or do you want to face it head on? The people who want me, who want us, won't stop. They'll come for you, for both of us. And if you're not prepared, if you don't fight back, it will destroy everything you love." Jason's mind raced. He had never imagined his life could be like this. He had never thought he would be caught in the middle of something so dangerous, so sinister. But now, there was no going back. The truth was out. And whatever came next, whatever choice he made, he would have to face it. "I don't know what to do, Dad," Jason said softly, his voice barely audible. "How do I fight back? How do I survive in all of this?" His father's eyes softened for a moment, but his voice was firm. "You fight by staying strong, by holding on to who you are. You don't let them change you, Jason. And you don't let them win. You're smarter than they think. You're stronger than they know." Jason felt a surge of determination rise within him. His father's words, though painful, had given him something he hadn't had before: clarity. The road ahead would be dangerous, and he might not have all the answers. But one thing was certain: he couldn't back down. He couldn't let fear control him. Jason stood up, his body shaking with the weight of everything he had just learned. "I'm going to take control of my life. I'm going to fight for what's right. And I'm going to make sure they never hurt anyone again." His father looked at him with a mixture of pride and regret. "I wish I could have given you a different life, Jason. But I'm proud of you. You're stronger than I ever was." Jason nodded, a fire igniting within him. The fight was far from over, but he was ready. Ready to take on whatever came next. Because in the end, the only thing that mattered was what he chose to do with the truth.